The village of Emberville sat at the base of Mount Cinder, and for 300 years no one had dared build so much as a sheep pen within sight of the mountain's smoldering peak. But the mountain had not erupted in living memory, and people forget. They always forget. And so the village grew, and the smoke that sometimes curled from the caldera became as ordinary as chimney smoke, and the distant rumbling in the deep hours of night became no more alarming than a sleeping husband's snoring. No one in Emberville thought about dragons anymore. Which was why it was such a surprise, such an absolute, throat-closing, bucket-dropping surprise, when a dragon appeared in Old Merritt's turnip field on a Tuesday morning in early autumn. It was small. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Not the scales, which caught the pale morning light and scattered it in colors that didn't quite exist in any painter's catalog, a blue-green bronze that shifted with every movement like oil on a cold puddle. Not the wings, which were folded tight against its body and were still large enough to shade a market stall. Not the tail, which had already knocked over 2 rows of turnips simply by existing and being uncertain where to put itself. No, the first thing everyone noticed was that it was small. Not small the way a horse is small compared to a barn. Small the way a foal is small compared to a horse. Small in the way that made the women of Emberville, who had grown up with the stories, who had been frightened into good behavior as children by tales of fire and ruin, and the terrible dragons of the mountain, look at the creature sitting in the middle of the ruined turnips and feel something dangerously close to fond. "It's a baby," said Widow Callahan, who had her market basket on her arm and had been walking past when it happened. She set the basket down with the matter-of-fact decisiveness of a woman who had raised 5 sons and was not particularly bothered by emergencies. "It's a dragon," said Old Merritt from his farmhouse doorway, his voice carrying equal parts outrage and terror. "Bobbies can be both things," said Widow Callahan and walked closer. The dragon, Ember, the village would eventually call him, because he smelled faintly of wood smoke and seemed embarrassed about it, was perhaps 2 years old in dragon years, which the village blacksmith, who had once, memorably, read half a book about mythological creatures before falling asleep, estimated was roughly equivalent to 7 or 8 in human years. He was about the size of a large draft horse, which was still considerably smaller than any adult dragon anyone had ever described, and he had the particular quality of young things everywhere. An excess of limbs relative to his ability to coordinate them, a tendency to make more noise than necessary, and eyes that were disproportionately large in his face, golden as fresh-poured honey, and expressing with crystal clarity every single emotion he experienced. He had arrived, as far as anyone could determine, alone. This was the part that troubled them. Not the fire, he breathed fire, yes, but only in small frightened puffs, and mostly when startled and mostly aimed at the ground, and he always looked extremely sorry about it afterward. Not the wings, not the tail, not the scales that had an alarming tendency to shed unexpectedly and turn up in people's bread or memorably in the communal soup pot. What troubled them was the aloneness. A baby dragon, alone on a mountainside, with no mother in sight and no indication that a mother was coming. Widow Callahan, who had housed the creature in her barn while the village argued about what to do with it, watched it sleep that first night from the barn doorway. It had curled itself into a tight circle the way cats do, its tail wrapped around its nose, its wings folded like a collapsed market umbrella, and it made small noises in its sleep, little waffling sounds, punctuated occasionally by a brief harmless lick of flame that dissipated before it reached the hay. She stood there for a long time. She had lost her youngest son, Petter, to a fever 8 years ago. He had been 7. She still had his things in a chest at the foot of her bed, his wooden sword, his collection of interesting rocks, the hat she'd knitted him that he'd hated and refused to wear, and his teddy bear, which he had named Captain, and which had been his constant companion from the age of 2 until the fever took him. She stood in the doorway of her barn, watching the baby dragon sleep, and then she went back inside her house and came out with Captain tucked under her arm. She left him just inside the barn door. By morning, the bear had moved. It took the village 3 weeks to stop arguing about the dragon and start actually dealing with it. During those 3 weeks, Widow Callahan fed it mostly sheep, which it ate with the slightly guilty enthusiasm of a creature who knows it should probably not be this excited about something, but can't help it, and watched it with the careful attention she had once given to each of her sons in turn. She observed that it was afraid of thunderstorms, and would press itself into the farthest corner of the barn when lightning struck, making a sound she could only describe as mewling, which was not a word she had ever expected to associate with a creature of ancient mythological terror. She observed that it was curious about everything, the chickens, the well, the cart, the door hinges, her cat Marzipan, the color red, and that this curiosity expressed itself primarily as poking things with its nose, and then recoiling with surprise when the things turned out to be real. She observed that it had apparently never been taught to eat gracefully, and would attack each meal with a chaotic enthusiasm that left her yard looking like the aftermath of a disagreement. And she observed what it did with Captain every night. The bear was old, His stuffing had migrated in the way that stuffing does over years of handling, giving him a lumpy, asymmetric silhouette. One of his button eyes had been replaced twice, she thought, so that his two eyes were different sizes. His fur was worn to near transparency in places, most notably across the top of his head and down his left arm where small hands had held him night after night for 5 years. The first night when she'd found him moved, she hadn't been sure what to make of it. By the third night, she understood. The dragon, Ember, she'd started thinking of him already, couldn't help it, would carry Captain very carefully in his mouth during the evening, not biting down, just holding him, the way a mother cat carries kittens. Then he would arrange Captain against his chest as he curled up to sleep, and he would breathe slowly, carefully, directing his sleeping fire away from the bear with what looked like tremendous concentration, and he would sleep. He held the bear the way her petter had held him. The way children hold things that make the dark feel smaller. The village reached a consensus of a kind, which is to say that enough people stopped actively calling for the dragon's removal that the ones who wanted him to stay could pretend agreement had been reached. He was too young to be a threat. He was alone. He needed feeding, and though this was said quietly and with considerable embarrassment, perhaps something more than feeding. The blacksmith, whose name was Joran and who had read half a book about mythological creatures, offered the opinion that young dragons did not typically survive without their mothers. He said this in the way that people say difficult things, looking at the floor, speaking quickly, hopping to be disagreed with. No one disagreed with him. Widow Callahan said nothing. She went home and looked at the chest at the foot of her bed for a long time. Autumn deepened and Ember stayed. He learned the village the way children learn new places all at once, through the soles of his feet and the width of his eyes, absorbing everything. He learned that Joran the blacksmith's forge smelled wonderful and that he was not, under any circumstances, allowed near it. He learned that the baker's apprentice, a boy named Davy, was willing to share his lunch if you sat next to him and looked at the bread with exactly the right expression. He learned that cats were not afraid of him, which he seemed to find personally meaningful. He learned that rain felt strange on his scales and that puddles were extremely interesting, and that if you landed in a puddle too hard, you would spray mud on everyone nearby and they would make a particular face. He was learning the world the way Bobbies do, one discovery at a time. And every night, without exception, he carried Captain to his sleeping place. Widow Callahan watched this and thought about things she tried not to think about. She thought about the way grief works in young things, the reaching for what is familiar, the holding on to what smells like safety. She thought about how Petter in the last weeks of his illness had held Captain so tightly that one of the bear's seams had come undone and she'd had to restitch it at midnight while Petter slept, because he would have been distressed to wake and find Captain damaged. She thought about what the dragon was carrying when he carried that bear. She thought about what it meant that he was carrying it alone. The first snow came in early November, earlier than usual, and Ember was fascinated by it in the way that young creatures are fascinated by the first appearance of any new phenomenon. With his entire body, without reservation, throwing himself at the snow with an enthusiasm that resulted in several spectacular falls, a considerable amount of accidental fire, and one extremely concerned chicken who had been minding its own business in the yard. Widow Callahan watched from her doorway, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and something in her chest did an uncomfortable thing that she had become expert at ignoring. Davy the baker's apprentice, who had taken to stopping by after his shift, came to stand beside her. He was 12, and he had the particular sensitivity of children who have paid close attention to adults and learned that adults are often pretending to feel less than they do. "He's never seen snow before," Davy said. "No," said Widow Callahan's. They watched Ember attempt to eat a snowflake. Just one, very specifically, tracking it with his enormous golden eyes as it drifted down, making small adjustments of his head, opening his mouth and snap at it and then look confused when it wasn't there anymore. "He's going to need warmer bedding," Davy said, "for the barn." "I know," said Widow Callahan. "I've already ordered more straw from Merritt." "Merritt's still angry about the turnips." "Merritt is always angry about something. It's his hobby." Davy was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "Does he know what the bear is, Ember, I mean, does he know it came from?" "No," said Widow Callahan. "He's a baby, he doesn't know what it means. He just knows it feels right to hold it." Davy considered this. "Is that sad?" "Yes," she said without hesitating, "and no." She began, that winter, to do something she hadn't planned to do. She began to tell him stories. Not stories about dragons. She didn't know any stories about dragons that weren't full of fire and destruction and knights and the gleaming satisfaction of a terrible death, and those seemed, on consideration, not quite right. She told him the stories she had told her boys, the ones her grandmother had told her. Stories about clever youngest children outwitting their siblings, stories about fishermen who caught something unexpected. Stories about the sea, which Emberville had never seen and Widow Callahan had visited exactly once at 23 and had never forgotten. Ember could not understand words yet, she knew that. But she had watched Bobby's enough to know that understanding words is not, at first, the point. The point is the voice, the cadence, the sense that a particular sound in a particular tone means you are safe and attended to and the night will pass. She sat on a hay bale in the barn, Captain in her lap, and she talked. Ember would settle in as she spoke, she could see it happen, the tension leaving his body the way smoke disperses, his wings folding in more tightly, his tail curling, his eyes growing heavier. He would look at her with those honey gold eyes and she would talk and the barn would fill with the faint smell of smoke and the distant sound of winter wind. And this was, in its strange way, one of the most peaceful things she had experienced in 8 years. She thought about Petter every time. She thought about him with a grief that had become, over 8 years, less like a wound and more like a scar. Always there, pressure-sensitive, changed in texture from the surrounding skin. She thought about how he had looked on the last night, when the fever finally broke but left him so diminished, so paper-thin, and how Captain had been tucked under his arm, and how she had whispered the same stories to him, one after another, through the long, dark hours. She was not, she told herself, replacing her son. That would be a strange and somewhat alarming thing to attempt with a dragon. But grief, she had learned, does not necessarily close. Sometimes it opens. Sometimes it becomes, over time, a capacity rather than only a wound. Spring arrived late, as springs do in mountain country, creeping in with hesitant green and uncertain warmth and then without announcement committing, and suddenly everything was mud and flowers and the smell of thaw, and Ember grew. He grew the way young animals do in spring, obviously, undeniably, measurably from week to week. His wings, which had been proportionally too large for his body in the autumn, began to look more appropriate. His coordination improved. He learned to land without destroying things most of the time. He also began to understand words. Widow Callahan noticed this gradually, the way you notice any gradual thing, only in retrospect, looking back, realizing the moment of change was earlier than you'd thought. One morning she said, "Careful, there's a patch of ice," and he navigated around it. One afternoon she said, "Joran would like you to move away from the forge, please," and he moved. One evening she said, "It's going to rain, come inside," meaning come into the barn, and he came. The words he seemed to understand first were all instructions and all connected to her. He learned her voice before he learned the language. This seemed right somehow, it was the order of things. The night she understood what the bear meant to him, really understood, not just suspected, was a night in late March when a late storm came through, worse than any since the winter, with lightning that cracked the sky open in terrible bright seams and thunder that rolled down from the mountain like something ancient and angry being woken. She found him at 2 in the morning, when she couldn't sleep, and went to the barn to check on him. Wedged into the corner with his wings pulled over his head and his tail curled tight and Captain held against his chest with both forelegs, making that sound, the mewling sound that she had never expected to associate with anything related to dragons. She sat down beside him in the hay in the dark, with the storm battering the barn walls. She put her hand on his side, on the scales, which were warm as sun-heated stone even in the cold, and she felt him shaking. "I know," she said quietly because there was nothing else to say. "I know." She could feel him breathe against her hand, shallow, fast, afraid. "You're all right," she said. "The barn is solid, the storm will pass." He turned his head slightly, and one enormous golden eye regarded her from beneath the shelter of his wing. She could see his own reflection in it, a small woman in a nightdress, sitting on a hay bale in a winter barn, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. "You're not alone," she said. She didn't plan to say it. It came out with the ease of things that are true. She sat with him until the storm eased, her hand on his side, talking in the low, steady voice she used for the stories. She didn't tell a story. She just talked about the weather, about the spring planting, about the bread Davy had brought yesterday, which had been very good, about the chickens, who were all fine. She had checked before coming here, everyone was fine. Small things, ordinary things. The texture of the world continuing to exist. When she finally felt his breathing slow and his shaking stop, she looked down and found that Captain had been moved. He was still against Ember's chest, but Ember had shifted somehow so that one foreleg held the bear and the other was pressed, very gently, against her knee. She sat there for a long time looking at that. Summer came and with it visitors. Emberville had always been a village that people passed through rather than visited, lying as it did on the road between two more interesting places, but word of the dragon had traveled, of course it had, news of dragons always travels, and by July there was a steady trickle of people who came specifically to see him. Scholars, mostly, who wanted to take measurements and write in their notebooks. A few knights who arrived in armor and left in considerably less confidence than they'd arrived with, their lances unnecessary and their war horses alarmed by Ember's enthusiastic interest in making friends with them. Several children from distant villages whose parents had clearly brought them specifically to see a dragon, while also clearly being far more interested themselves. Ember tolerated all of this with the particular grace of a young creature who has been well handled, curious rather than aggressive, watchful but not afraid, occasionally startling everyone by being inexplicably delighted by something unremarkable. One of the scholars, a woman who had devoted her academic life to dragon physiology, spent 3 days with him and left looking shaken in a way that had nothing to do with fire or claws. She pulled Widow Callahan aside before she left. He's extraordinarily well-adjusted, the scholar said. She had the slightly stunned look of someone whose data has contradicted their assumptions. For a solitary juvenile, they don't usually adapt to human company like this, and they certainly don't, she paused, consulting some internal debate. He keeps a stuffed bear. I know, said Widow Callahan's. Is it yours? It was my son's. The scholar looked at her for a moment with the careful attention of someone assembling a picture from partial information. Your son, she said. He died 8 years ago. He was 7. Widow Callahan said it the way she said it now, directly, without flinching, because grief handled long enough becomes something you can carry without dropping. He was a good boy. Ember reminds me of him sometimes. The bear, the scholar said slowly. For the dragon, it functions as a comfort object. They don't usually form attachments to. He formed an attachment to it, Widow Callahan said simply. The same way children do, it smells safe to him, it feels like being held. The scholar left the next morning. Widow Callahan never found out what she wrote in her notebooks. Autumn again, and Ember was bigger. Still young, still clearly young, the scholars had agreed on that, still years from anything resembling adulthood, but bigger in the way that changes the quality of a presence. He no longer fit comfortably in Joran's shadow. The barn that had seemed more than adequate in the autumn of his arrival was now somewhat optimistic in its assessment of what constituted adequate. He had learned that summer to fly, to really fly. Not just the terrified wing beating of a frightened young thing, but genuine sustained flight, spiraling up above the mountain in the early mornings when the air was still and cold and clear, visible from the village as a small bright moving shape against the blue. He always came back. This was, Widow Callahan noticed, not a foregone conclusion. She had watched him learning the updrafts with the absorbed determination of a creature discovering what it was built for, and she had thought, he could go, he could just go. And she had sat with that thought and found that she could hold it without breaking. He always came back. He came back to her yard, to Davy's lunch, to Marzipan the cat who had claimed the warm space between Ember's forelegs as her personal territory, and defended it with a conviction that suggested she believed herself to be the larger animal. He came back to the smell of the forge and the routine of the days and the evenings in the barn where Widow Callahan told her stories, and the night smelled of smoke and hay, and the specific particular piece of being somewhere you belong. And he came back to Captain's. Every night still, the bear was carried carefully and held carefully, and the old worn fabric and the slightly wrong button eyes and the stuffing that had shifted to make odd lumps and hollows. All of it was held as though it were the most important thing in the world. The night that broke Widow Callahan's heart was an October night, dry and cold and brilliant with stars. The kind of night that exists specifically to be beautiful at. And she had come to the barn late because she couldn't sleep and had long since stopped pretending that she came to the barn for any reason other than the company. She found Ember awake. He was sitting up, not curled, not sleeping, and he was looking at Captain, who was held in his foreleg with a care that had, over the past year, learned itself into something that looked almost gentle. He was just looking at him. Widow Callahan stood in the doorway and watched, and something in her chest did the uncomfortable thing again, but slower, deeper. She had not seen him look at the bear that way before. Before it had always been the quick, certain claiming of a known comfort, picking up Captain and settling down, the gesture complete in itself, not requiring contemplation. But this was different. This was Ember examining something with the dawning capacity of a mind that was growing past the point of simply receiving comfort and beginning to think about the things that comforted him. He was, she realized, beginning to understand. Not everything, not the full weight of what the bear represented, not grief and lost boys and the specific pain of a thing loved and gone. He didn't have the context for that. But he was old enough now, developed enough to notice that the bear was old. To notice that it was worn in ways that spoke of before him. To look at the thin patches on the bear's head and arm where small hands had held it night after night for 5 years before he was born, and to understand that he was not the first. She could see him working through it. She had watched children do this, the moment when they notice that something beloved has a history they're not part of and feel for the first time the weight of before. He looked up and found her in the doorway. For a moment they simply looked at each other, dragon and woman, the barn smelling of smoke and cold air and old hay. Outside, the stars terrible and beautiful and indifferent. Then he made a sound she had never heard him make before, not the mewling of fear, not the sharp bark of startlement, not the low satisfied rumble that she had come to understand meant something like good or comfortable or here. This was something slower, lower, with an unevenness to it that reminded her suddenly and completely of her son asking her at 4 years old standing at his grandfather's grave, "Where did he go, Mum?" That question, that specific impossible aching question. She crossed the barn and sat down beside him, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, because there are situations that require you to acknowledge their full weight before you can speak into them. "His name was Captain," she said at last. Ember was still looking at the bear. She watched him register the word, not understanding it, not having the concept of names yet, not quite, but hearing the particular quality of how she said it. The way names sound different from other words, personal, specific. This one, not another. "My son's name was Petter," she said. "He was 7 when he died. He had Captain from the time he was 2. She reached out and touched the bear gently. Ember did not pull him away. "He was so proud of this bear," she said. "He thought Captain was very brave. He used to tell me about Captain's adventures, all the things Captain had done while Petter was at school, all the battles he'd fought, all the places he'd been." She paused. "I used to listen very seriously. I think that was the right thing to do." She looked at Ember's face. He was listening. She could tell not by any particular signal, just by the quality of his stillness, the direction of those honey gold eyes. "I gave him to you because I thought maybe they were the same kind of thing. Petter holding Captain, you holding him." She thought about how to say the next part. Someone young, alone in the dark, who needed something to hold on to. Ember made the sound again, that slow, low, uneven sound. "I know," she said. She did not try to stop her voice from being what it was, which was a voice that had been broken once and healed imperfectly, the way broken things do. "I know." She sat with him in the silence for a while. The stars moved overhead in the gaps in the barn boards. The cold deepened. Then slowly, carefully, with the deliberateness of a creature that has learned through long months that careful, slow movements are the right kind near people who matter, Ember reached out and set Captain gently in her lap. She looked down at the bear. Her hands, without her deciding, folded around him, the automatic gesture of someone who has held a particular thing so many times the body remembers it without the mind. Captain was warm. From being held against Ember's chest all evening, he was warm and smelled faintly of smoke. She held him for a moment. Then she looked up at Ember, who was watching her with those enormous golden eyes that hid nothing, ever, and she thought about what it costs to hand over something you've been holding. "Thank you," she said. He was young and didn't know what the words meant. But he understood thank you the way Bobbies understand it, not the words but the quality, the warmth, the recognition of something given and received. She had said it to him enough times. "Thank you for coming back, thank you for not scaring the chickens today, thank you for being patient with Joran, thank you for existing here in this ordinary, miraculous way." She handed Captain back. He took him with the same careful deliberateness. For a moment they both held him, her hands, his forelegs, and the barn was very quiet, and the stars continued to move, and something that had been tight in Widow Callahan's chest for 8 years loosened, just fractionally, just enough. Not gone, she was not naive enough to expect grief to go, but loosened. She thought later that the thing which had broken her heart was not what she'd expected. She had expected to feel broken by loss, by the reminder of Petter, by the sight of someone else holding the thing she'd given away. But the breaking was different. It was the kind of breaking that happens when something fits together, when two separate aches recognize each other and discover they can bear the weight between them. He did not know what he was carrying, not fully. He would not for years have the vocabulary to understand loss the way she understood it. Not until he was older and the world had taught him its crueler lessons, which it eventually teaches everyone. But he knew that Captain was old and had been held before, and that she had given him something precious, and that precious things come weighted with everything that made them precious. He knew, in the wordless certain way of young things, that he was not alone in the dark. And she knew, in the wordless certain way of people who have been alone for a long time, that the barn was warmer than it used to be. There is a saying in the mountain villages about grief, though it is said differently in different places and has no official source that anyone can point to. It goes something like this: grief does not end, it finds company. Widow Callahan thought about this saying often in the years that followed. She thought about it on the winter mornings when she brought Ember his breakfast and found him already awake, watching the snow. She thought about it in the springs when he flew above the mountain and she stood in her yard with her hand shielding her eyes to watch him, that small bright shape against the enormous sky. She thought about it when Davy grew up and moved away and came back with a wife and 2 small children who were, inevitably, completely unafraid of the dragon and absolutely fascinated by him, and who Ember bore with a patience that seemed specifically calibrated to the smallness of children. She thought about it every night when she came to the barn and sat on her hay bale and told her stories, and Ember settled beside her with that particular slow releasing of tension, and Captain was held carefully, and the dark outside was full of stars. Petter was not replaced. You do not replace the people you have lost. They are specific, irreplaceable, they exist in the exact shape of the space they left, and nothing fills that shape. She had known that for 8 years and did not unlearn it. But grief finds company, and the company it finds is not lesser for being different. The last thing, the part of the story that people, when they heard it later, said was the part that stayed with them, happened on a May morning when Ember was 3 years old, dragon years, which Joran had revised his estimate on several times and now placed at roughly 10 or 11 human years. Old enough to have opinions. Old enough to be deliberate. Old enough to understand more than he let on. Widow Callahan came to the barn that morning and found Ember waiting for her at the door. Which was not unusual. He was often awake before her, patient in the way that animals are patient, simply existing until the person they are waiting for arrives. What was unusual was that he had Captain in his mouth, and he set the bear down at her feet. She looked at him, he looked at her. "You want me to have him," she said. He made a sound, not the distressed one, not the joyful one, but something she had not heard before, soft and certain and deliberate. She looked at Captain for a long time. The worn fur, the mismatched button eyes, the asymmetric stuffing, the stitching she had redone once, twice. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know if I need him more than you do." He nudged the bear toward her with his nose, gently, deliberately. She picked Captain up. She held him and thought about Petter and thought about this strange animal life that had arrived in a turnip field and stayed, and thought about the difference between holding on and letting go and the third thing, the harder thing, which is learning to do both at once. "I'll keep him inside," she said. "For safekeeping, you can have him back whenever you want." She held Captain for a moment longer, then looked up at Ember, who was watching her with those eyes that held everything plainly, all the way to the bottom. "You've grown up some," she said, "haven't you?" He didn't answer. Young things rarely do when you speak the truth of them plainly. They just look at you and you know. She put Captain in her apron pocket, where he made a small warm weight against her hip, and she walked back to the house, and the morning was ordinary and beautiful, and from behind her she heard the great slow sound of wings as Ember stretched and shook himself and prepared for the day. She did not look back, she didn't need to. She knew he'd come in for breakfast. He always came back.